Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Adventures in Angular. This week on our panel, we have Subrat Mishra,
Hello, hello.
Lucas Paganini,
Hey,
and Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. This week we have a special guest, and that's Walid Bouguima. Walid, do you want to introduce yourself, say hello, let us know why you're famous?
hello, and thanks a lot, Charles, for the invite. My name is Walid. I'm from Tunisia. I'm working as software engineer at Hilti Group in France. I have been lead front-end developer at Lamy Insurance Technology, Lamy Global Holding, which is a fintech and insurance company. And I'm very delighted to be with you guys today on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we invited you because you wrote an article about basically how to write clean HTTP service methods. And it's a relatively short article, but this is something that we all do with our Angular apps. And so I thought we could talk about, hey, how do I talk to my backend, right? What's painful about it? What's great about it? What's not great about it? And then we can dive into some of the tools and libraries that are out there that may make it easier. So I'm kind of curious because you start with sort of the native way that Angular gives you with the HTTP client module, and you talk about how to clean it up. So let's start there with the HTTP client module, and talk about what people do right with it and wrong with it, and then we can move on to some of the other libraries that we may or may not be using for this kind of thing. So for people who are newer, do you want to just kind of give an overview of what the HTTP client module is and does, and then we can talk about how people get it wrong?
Yep, sure. So HTTP client module is out-of-the-box module provided by Angular. So if you install Angular, you don't need to basically use any third-party libraries to manage your communication with the backend. It allows you to establish communication for handling CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete, like communication with database. It basically uses observables under the hood to basically establish this communication. I have been using HTTP client module since I started with Angular without using any third-party library external to Angular. So that's almost it. It has also HTTP testing module as well if you want to create test files for your HTTP verbs, let's say, or calls to the backend. So it is like fully fledged libraries inside Angular, and it is very handy to basically handle communication even at large scale. It is just a matter of organizing your code to basically leverage this HTTP client module built-in methods.
Gotcha. So your article talks about an anti-pattern that people use for the HTTP client. Do you want to just walk us through that, like what people are doing wrong and then what you do to clean it up?
It is just my perspective on what is right and what is wrong. Probably in large-scale projects, you wouldn't like to violate the don't repeat yourself principle or dry principle. And thus you want to have this kind of encapsulated logic that is reusable in all your services. In probably very simple project, you have just handful of HTTP calls, but in a large scale project, you probably reach 100 calls. For instance, now in my current project, we are using GraphQL, but we are also using HTTP client as well. And we have a similar pattern as the one that is available in the article. So we don't repeat ourselves in terms of handling errors and managing the responses from the backend. So we have kind of central abstract service that does all the job, and all the consumer services are basically using this service to handle this communication. So that allows us basically to have a clean code, but also to have a central place in which you can basically establish the communication, and if there is any bug or something, you know where to go. Because if you have, let's say, 50, 60 files of services, and all of these services have different patterns of communication with the backend using a HTTP client module, you don't have consistency inside the code base, and the maintainability of the code base becomes very hard. So if you have this kind of pattern that I implemented in this article, probably that would be very helpful in terms of don't repeat yourself principle, for instance. Yeah, so that's one of the things that I started to notice in my old company. As we were growing, we were leveraging REST API, different endpoints, and every single developer was handling the backend the way he or she sees fit. So when I looked into the code base, there were different implementations of the exact same thing, which is communication with the backend. You find different implementations of the get request, of the get verb, of the post verb, of the update verb. So we decided to just basically build a service file that basically handles everything communication-wise with the backend. And if you want to establish communication with a particular endpoint, you just use the method that are inside the service without inventing the wheel.
Right. So the approach is effectively to build a wrapper around HTTP client module and then have everything use that so that everything's consistent across your entire app.
Exactly, yes.
Cool. Does that square with your experience, Subrat or Lucas?
If I remind myself, like most of the HTTP client we call nowadays, it's jumble with lot of RxJS operators. Like you pipe all them with different operators, and mostly as you told, like we handle, like suppose the get all the verbs of HTTP, get, put, post, delete, to a separate service, just call them and the response will be an observable, and then we pipe them with a different operator, and then subscribe that either directly as in a async pipe or in the component. Yeah, but what I about the once while you're talking, one thing came to my mind was, oh, uh, do do not reinvent the wheel or do not repeat yourself. We use lot of interceptor, like
Yes,
to handle the error. You use an interceptor and that will handle the error itself. And if you want to add some suppose a header which will be common for a lot of calls, then do that in a interceptor instead of calling that. So there are some basic uh, things which can be handled by different services or different interceptor, and try to segregate them.
exactly.
I think also if someone starts using NGRX, uh, and also there's some other mm, library, they are kind of going on those direction, like segregating the work to a particular place and do what needed on those places.
I had a question while I was reading your article. So one thing that I think needs to be clear to the audience is, what are the conditions that allow you to do such thing in your code base? I say that because sometimes you just don't have access to the backend. And if the backend is not consistent in the way that they return the error messages or whatever you're abstracting, then you can't really do that. This can actually be more detrimental than helpful, because I tend to use this for everything, which is developers, they are always trying to not copy and paste, and it feels the right thing to not copy and paste, but it actually depends, because if you use the wrong abstraction, then you would be better off just copy and pasting, because you'll be able to do the necessary changes that you need to make it work. So one scenario which I happened to be a few months ago in a project was the backend returned errors in different structures. Like, sometimes the backend would return an error wrapped in an object, and the error message would be in a property called error. Other times it would be a property called ERR. Other times it wouldn't return an object, just a string with the error message. So it was very
That
inconsistent.
sounds so fun.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah.
And we
I'm
did not
like-
have access. Yeah, we just couldn't do anything in the backend because we were limited in scope to the front end because, well, my company is basically an outsourcing of developers to another country so that you can have premium quality with in a country that has a cheaper currency, right? And so some companies they don't feel comfortable outsourcing their whole repository. Sometimes they just outsource the front end because the front end is something that at the end of the day, everybody can have access to your front end. You can just inspect the element and you see everything. So it happens that sometimes we simply don't have access to the backend. We only have access to the front end. So we can't make the necessary changes to the backend to make it consistent in the way that it handles successes and failures. So since we can't do that, and when we have inconsistencies in the backend, we can't use an approach such as the one that you suggest, because if we were to use this abstraction, there would be places that this abstraction wouldn't work, and then we would have to go inside of it and make changes to allow for such edge cases, and then you end up having an abstraction that is taking care of way too many scenarios, and it starts becoming a risk because every time that you add treatment for an edge case, you may also be handling wrong some of the other endpoints. So I would say for everyone that is listening to this is every time that you have some kind of standard in your whole application, front end and back end, you can abstract that. But if at any point you have inconsistencies, then I would rethink that. Maybe you can use an abstraction in if there is a common pattern. It may not be 100% consistent, but there are many endpoints that follow this pattern. Okay, so you can use an abstraction for those endpoints, but don't try to put everything in the same box. Like if you don't have an API call that you can use that abstraction, like just don't use it. That's okay too. I think the developers sometimes they get too hung up on, I need to use this abstraction. I made this code to reuse everything, so I have to use this function everywhere. And that's not the case. Like you need to make your application work. Okay, that's your goal as a developer. It's just that. So if you have an abstraction that you can use, that's great. But if the abstraction doesn't fit your needs or the particular endpoint that you're handling is different from the rest, that's okay too. Don't try to abstract that. You can always use the HTTP client directly or any other APIs that you need. So something to keep in mind.
So I'm going to push back here a little bit because, and granted, I haven't seen this backend, right? I'm trying to imagine, how awesome this this backend is. But anyway, so part of the deal is that I think you can compose a wrapper around the HTTP calls to a particular backend, right? So let's say it's this one that's got these inconsistent issues. You can encapsulate some of that stuff so that, for example, it's you have a response handler, and then you have an error handler, and then you have a right. And I'm thinking more object oriented, and I know that JavaScript doesn't always lend itself that way very easily. Sometimes it does, right? Sometimes it's like, hey, this fits really neatly into the boxes that JavaScript gives me, but not always, right? But then what you do is you pass your request or your response into some kind of function that just initializes an error object that's consistent, and it can take all those different kinds of inputs and give you a consistent kind of interface. And so there are ways to build these. Yeah, depending on the circumstances, it might be slightly over engineered for what you're dealing with, right? Or you might have so many edge cases that it's just, even that initialization's messy. But what I found is that as I've broken things up and composed things and, figured out what the right responsibilities are for the right, whether it's classes or prototypes or, in TypeScript, different, things there. What I found is that, yeah, there are ways to work around this so that you can have that nice, clean, consistent interface, because at the end of the day, having that driver and having that place to go for that common code is there are huge benefits to it. And so, it's got to be just so horrendously inconsistent that it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever to count on any kind of common structure in order for me to not want to try and do what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I agree. Like, it is kind of trade-off, because as Luca mentioned it, sometimes the backend is not as responsive as you may expect, but it is just a matter of convention between front end and back end to build the
Yeah.
system the way it should be. For instance, when I joined my new company, I found kind of different conventions than the ones that I have been in before. So I think it is just a matter of conventions, and then you can build the abstraction. So you need to accumulate the knowledge of the redundancies in the system, both front end and back end, and then try to reduce them as much as possible. And that's what we are trying to do even here in this new setup, to basically build as much abstraction as possible in order to leverage the dry principle and avoid replications in code base, knowing that we have like dozens of libraries inside in an X workspace. It is very critical to have this kind of abstraction.
Yeah, one other thing I'm just going to point out, because I think Luca is right that there may be just a handful of edge cases that don't fit, right?
Yeah.
That's the other side of this, right? And so if there are just those handful, right? So everything uses the abstraction we wrote, and then there are these 3 or 4 that just, you know what? There's just not a good clean way to stick them into this abstraction, right? Then what we do is, I hate comments in code, but I would put a comment in there explaining this has a structure that does not work with the interface we have. And so, we're handling it here to make sure that we capture the error or whatever, right? So just give a good explanation in the code as to why you're doing it the other way.
Exactly.
And then,
yes.
if you find that edge case occurs in a handful of cases, then you can abstract that into a different interface and tell people, hey, look, if it's this way, it's this one, and if it's this way, it's the other one.
What you can also
and
do,
then you may be able to put a facade in front of it even at that point and say, request handler, right? And then request handler is smart enough to look at the structure you get back and say, you're gonna go through this pipeline, and these other ones will go through the other pipeline, and then you can clean it up that way.
What I was trying to say is I just Charles' point triggered kind of a saying of one of my previous engineering managers, who was basically saying, like, it is always good to focus on patterns extraction before like solutions abstraction. So you have to extract the patterns, then you build the solution abstraction. So yeah.
Something that you can also do to help on what Charles was saying, like do those like other methods. For example, if you are in this scenario, use this abstraction. If you're in this other scenario, use this other abstraction. One thing that I really like that helps with that is to use functional programming and always break things in very small abstractions. Because, for example, let's say that you're creating an abstraction for all API requests. This abstraction can be either a single function that does all the abstraction that you need, or it can be a function that internally calls others. So it's a function that is composed by other functions. So the more granular you can get in the responsibilities of your individual functions, the more you can reuse them. So even if you are in a terrible situation, such as the one that I found myself a couple months ago, you may not be able to reuse the whole abstraction everywhere, but there are parts of it that you can. So for example, if you know that a particular endpoint is going to return a string in case there's an error, you can create a function that looks at the return data from the API, and if it's just a string, treats that as an error. If it's an object, returns it as success. If a different endpoint treats errors differently, so for example, a different endpoint might return an error wrapped in an object with the property called error. Okay, then you can create an abstraction that can take the response data and see if it's an object with the error property or if it's not. If it's not, then it's success. If it is that, then it's an error message. So you can have different functions that extract the response to see if it's a success or a failure. And then you can plug that into the rest of your abstraction. So you have a part of your API endpoints abstraction that is the part of it that is responsible for identifying if the response was a success or a failure. And what you can do is, if you isolate that check into another abstraction, then you can swipe out the abstractions as you need them. So this particular endpoint, you need to use this particular error extractor. This other endpoint, you need to use another error extractor. So this way you can make your abstractions more flexible because you can also internally customize them. So that's a way to go around that. But again, we're just talking about like a case that I hope most developers never get to. So I know that the case that I brought up was very, very specific. And I completely agree with what Charles said, which is there are going to be many consistent things in the backend. Even if there are many inconsistencies, there will also be many things that are consistent. So you should still create abstractions because they will benefit you. Even if you can't use them everywhere, they will still benefit you. It's just, I think it's really important to bring that up because I found myself in this trap before of having a scenario that doesn't fit a particular abstraction and then trying to make it fit. And you shouldn't be wasting time on that. You should use the right abstraction. So if that abstraction doesn't work, either you make it more flexible, in the example that I gave of giving an error extractor so that you can customize the way that it identifies if it was success or failure, or you can just create a different abstraction. So just don't ever waste a lot of time trying to fit your use case in the abstraction that you already have. If it fits, okay. If it doesn't, then just do something else.
Yeah, I think you're presupposing a little bit that people have and take the time to refactor, right? I think that's the other piece of this, right? So yeah, you're like, look, this doesn't fit. I'm going to eject. I'm going to use just the, HTTP client module, and I'm just going to go raw HTTP call on it. What you need to be doing then is going back and looking at that periodically and saying, is there a way that I can make this better? Because if you can make that easier to follow, make it easier to read, make it easier to reason about, then you get to the point where, yeah, somebody else can come along and maintain the code better. I also want to point out that, Lucas, your situation was a little bit different in that I think most developers on most teams that are doing Angular are either working on a third-party back-end API that is reasonably consistent. Not always, right? I mean, I've worked on some third-party APIs that are really, really heinous. I've also worked on some that are just not well documented, and that makes it hard too. But most of the time, you're either working on something like that where the API has kind of a deliberate design, or you're working with a back-end team that is internal to your company. So you can go to them and say, hey, what you're doing is making it really hard for us to maintain on the front end. And if you could standardize on these 3 things, it would solve a lot of our problems. And so I want to just point out that in either case, communication may be your friend here, right? It may not be a technical solution. It may be a people solution. And you may just need to go talk to the people who are providing you your data and saying, hey, have you thought about doing this? Because it would make it a lot easier. And if it's a third-party API and it's a solid suggestion, I mean, I would hope that most product companies would appreciate that. And then if it's an internal thing, hopefully you have a healthy enough culture to where they just look at you and say that makes a lot of sense, right? We are building this to service what you're writing, so we'll solve that. But it sounds like in Lucas's case, those weren't really options that he could pursue aggressively.
Yeah, exactly. Just probably to build on top of what Charles just was saying is the importance of documentation. Like if you are building abstractions, it is very important also to document this very well, because for instance, when I joined the new code base, I found a lot of built-in abstractions inside the code base, and sometimes it is very hard to reason about them. And sometimes you just opt to use the native capabilities of the frameworks just to leverage value as fast as possible without spending much time understanding why this person did this abstraction, right? So I think like the other side is documentation is very important when you build abstractions.
Yeah, and also like I was just thinking when all the discussion happening is coming to my mind, all the methodology, all the architecture and everything is always always depends on the situations. Like if you have a architecture or have a methodology and you have a complete different situation, you can't just grab a methodology and put in your situation and like put in your situation and that you should not expect it's going to behave pretty good uh, because like the what Lucas said in his situation, like suppose there are a lot of variables are different, lot of there's continuous back and forth is going on with the back end and front end, a lot of things, so that then it's might be better to go with a normal approach then. But in most of the scenario where we have a solid backend object what you are getting, and then we can implement all those like happy path scenario, and then you can have lot of implementation
Mm-hmm.
by not considering the like it's kind of if you're creating some methodology or abstraction, you are thinking like the backend should give something, because suppose in the front end if you are doing this dot something, if the backend change the name of dot to something else, this is going to break. No matter what we'll do, like we can't go ahead and write abstraction every day, like just to change the name every day and just talk with them. So that would be a contact between the front end and back end. I know in the ideal scenario, like it should be there, but in a lot of scenario it's a like pretty hard to get sometime. So always what I might suggest, or like first check your scenario of why, what is the problem in your code, then try to solve that with a uh, better methodology or better abstraction which will suit for your particular use case. But what Walid is saying, I think it will because I haven't experienced this kind of problem, because fortunately I always worked on both sides, like front end and
Mm-hmm.
back end, so I have the control on both. But I know that some of my friends worked on, but they always have a communication, like they will always have a swagger file or path to check what the backend gives. But I think most, according to me, at least 90 to 95% of time only the approach will going to work, but some 10% might need to find a way around on that and try to fit something else.
Yeah, I think the last point is very critical because also communication is important, right, between backend and front end.
Hmm.
I mean, like it's not like the technical communication between front end code and back end code, but the human communication between developers to establish these kind of conventions. Um, I think there is like kind of law, like Conway's law, which basically states that the design system is a mirror of the communication strategies inside the team, right? So if the communication between team members is broken, then you cannot build a solid, resilient system, right? So you cannot build an abstraction around Angular HTTP client module if you do not have standard backend responses and agreements on the responses shape. And also, I think TypeScript helps a lot in terms of interfaces as a convention between API responses and front-end code. So that's also a good point also to mention.
Now, one other thing that I'm curious about is, do you all use the HTTP client module to make your HTTP calls? Or are you using some other third-party library that gives you a cleaner, nicer, I guess, more natural to you interface?
For me, actually, I use it to use HTTP client module for a while, I would say, since I started with Angular. But with my new setup, GraphQL is kind of runtime system that sits between front end and back end. And HTTP client module wouldn't work here because there is also a wrapper around the GraphQL to establish communication, which is Apollo, right? So Angular Apollo is a very handy library that we are using here. And as far as I know, the whole system is using Apollo Angular to handle communication with the GraphQL runtime. And it is kind of an abstraction as well around HTTP client module. And it is very clean, and it has a lot of parts that are keen to GraphQL system as well. Like for instance, fragments. You can like make a query to the backend with the fragments, and these fragments can be reused in other parts of the system. So for me, like I was not really expecting it to be as mature as it is, because I think GraphQL is kind of new to the ecosystem, but Apollo is kind of strong and also like scalable with Apollo Federation, for instance, and it is like a topic that is studied now inside the company. So I think it is also a good option to use Apollo, but inside Angular, I think there is also NGRX, right? With the effects, you can also establish communication with the backend. So that's also something very useful that I had the chance to work with.
Yeah, I think GraphQL alleviates a lot of these issues, right? Because you have to give responses back with a certain structure. You can make certain assumptions about what you're going to see and how you're going to see it.
Exactly.
And so at the end of the day, it solves a lot of this, and those interfaces are looked at by, hundreds of developers, and they tend to, be kept clean and give you specific ways of doing specific things. And so I think it really kind of, it obviates a lot of these problems. It just makes them not really exist. You have different issues, you're making different trade-offs, but if this is your problem, it makes this particular problem go away.
Exactly, yes.
On that question, Chuck, about using or not HTTP client, I do have something that I consider really important to say, which is even if you want to use a different abstraction because of a cleaner interface or you just prefer a different syntax, be sure that this other interface, this other abstraction internally uses the HTTP client. So for example, Walid gave the example of NGRX and also Apollo Angular. I have never used Apollo Angular myself, but I would bet that internally it uses the HTTP client. That's important because Axios, for example, Axios by default uses the fetch protocol, the native browser fetch protocol. And that can be a problem if you're in Angular applications, because that means that you're making your requests outside of the framework. It may sound like a small thing, for example, but what am I losing? Am I just losing HTTP interceptors? I don't need HTTP interceptors, whatever. It's not just that. There are other things that Angular does, and it can only do if you're using the HTTP client, because the HTTP client you're making an HTTP request and it's going from inside the framework. So the framework is aware of it. And one of the things that it can do, for example, besides HTTP interceptors, is if you are running your application server side too, then you will need the HTTP client. Otherwise, Angular will not know if your components are already stable and ready to be given to the front and ready to be rendered. So in the backend, you will need to be using the HTTP client if you're using server-side rendering with your Angular application. And it can also serve as a caching layer. So if you are using server-side rendering in Angular, then once your requests are made in the backend, they don't have to be made again in the front end. So when the backend gives the rendered front end back to the client, they can already give the cached responses for the HTTP requests that it had to make. And then when the front end loads and tries to make those calls, it just gets the cached result. So it doesn't have to make those HTTP calls again. So that's a small detail that you can only achieve if you are using the HTTP client. So it's not a problem if you prefer a different interface, a different syntax than the one that the HTTP client gives you. Just make sure that whatever abstraction you create internally uses the HTTP client, so that all your HTTP calls, they go through the internals of the Angular framework, and Angular is aware that you're making those calls and is aware of the responses that you got, because Angular does some things with that information.
Yeah, I think Lucas was absolutely right on the basis of if like that Angular is not only making a HTTP call, it's going through a process like in the upward and then coming back again to the component. But I would suggest, like, I have used like what like for the Charles question to other HTTP clients. So I sometimes use fetch, directly fetch. So in those cases, suppose one of the scenario is if I am calling something from the worker and I don't want the execution to be flow, then I use fetch there directly, so that I need to pass the context and all, and so it will do the work and just get us the result back in, instead of going through the whole angular process. And also similar case, if you are if you want to run something outside Angular, you don't want to run the change detection with it, and but I know that is rare. If you want to run something and you want to call the server, getting it back, in those scenario you can use either fetch or other XHR request to get a result without informing Angular, and just push your updated data to the Angular change detection or Angular DOM, you can say.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, that
like
does sound like a little extra work.
Exactly.
Yeah, if it's like performance is the,
Yeah.
if you are counting on milliseconds, then
Okay.
then it might be.
So that's the trade you're making, right? Is performance
Yeah.
versus
Yes, performance was, yeah.
simplicity, I guess.
I was about to say, like, you can even build this kind of wrappers around not only classes, but the verbs themselves. Like, if we are familiar with Jest, for instance, not Jest, Nastgs, which is like Angular in the backend, right? They have this kind of decorators to handle backend communication. So you have @get, @put, @post, @delete, and then you just fire the observables with these decorators. So I attempted actually to build this kind of decorators with HTTP verbs on Angular, and just using the decorator pattern, and it works very well. Actually, you just have like a function, name it @get or name it whatever you want, and then internally it uses HTTP client. And then in your services and your classes, you just call this function or import it, and then you just pass the endpoint to it. And then in the decorated function or method, you just pass the response. And it's, I think, way cleaner than basically handling this with a class wrapper around HTTP client module.
Yep, yeah, I think Nest nailed it with
Yeah.
I think they did this. They got the concept from what I got it by working in Nest is they got all the concept from Spring Boot. They all the concept from Angular. Try to merge them and did a very good job.
I'm gonna do
Cool.
the opposite opinion here. Sorry, but I really tried. I really tried to use Nest because I like Angular so much that, and Nest just fits so well if you're in an NX workspace. Like, it integrates well with all the other libraries in your mono repo, that I so wanted to use it. And the documentation is so well done. They have so many stars. I was outshined by all the greatness of Nest, but I really didn't like using the Angular approach in the backend. And I think in my case, it's because I feel like object-oriented programming really fits well in the front end. I myself don't like object-oriented programming too much. I prefer functional programming, but I try to be pragmatic in my choices, and it feels like object-oriented programming really fits well in components. Like, when you're thinking, when you have the mental model of a component, you think of a component having state. So this to me is an indicator that object-oriented programming works well for components. Like, I think of a class when I'm thinking of a button, when I'm thinking of a card component. It really makes sense. But when I'm in the backend, I feel like functional programming works best. It's easier for me to understand the flow of the application. If you're in the front end, for example, there are way too many scenarios for you to interact with something. You can have 3 buttons, and those 3 buttons can activate the same action. In the backend, you don't really have that too much. You generally have one endpoint that does what you need. If you need that thing, you call this endpoint. So it just feels like using functional programming in the backend feels like the right choice, to me at least. And Nest didn't provided me with ways to use functional programming in the backend, even though in the docs they say that they are object-oriented and reactive functional programming. I feel like they are much more object-oriented than functional programming oriented. And this was really hard to me, so I really tried using that. Everybody from my team hated it, to be honest. Right from the start, they were like, really, I don't think this is the right pattern here. But I was like, no, let's try more. And we really pushed after all the hate, and the hate just stayed there. I thought it would slow down while people get used to it, but we just didn't get used to it. It always felt like the wrong approach for backend. So that was my experience with Nest. If you're listening to this and you are getting very angry at me, I'm sorry. I tried.
Well, I think that's the wonderful thing about programming is that
Yeah.
we all have different things that we like. The other thing is you may have picked up something that, it's like, I'm going to build this in Nest, and it's just not a good fit for Nest, right? I mean, there are a million reasons why it may or may not have worked for you, but I mean, that's the great thing is, it's like, hey, this just, my mental model and Nest's mental model just don't jive, and so I'm going to use something else, and that's awesome, right? We have so many other good options, like Rails, which is my
Exactly.
back end of choice, right? I love writing in Ruby, or you may want to go pick up Express or Sales or something else in JavaScript, right? Because that's your cup of tea, and they all work, and it's cool. So yeah, I mean, I would recommend it to anybody if you're doing Angular to at least try it, right? And then from there you can say, you know what, this one's not for me, right? No harm done. But yeah.
For me, like from my experience with Angular, when I wanted to try the backend work, Nastgs was the smoothest transition possible for me towards backend. Even though like Angular is kind of object oriented, shifting towards Spring Boot or Java is kind of painful compared to Nastgs. At least the same mental model inside Angular is in Nastgs. So I did not really find it difficult to build API endpoints with Nastgs. The same concept, the same design patterns, decorators, the singleton, you inject the service inside constructors. So it was exactly the same. If you have kind of familiarity with Angular, Nastgs is, from my perspective, a good option to try in the backend.
A good framework, bad framework, it's always a debate.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, one
Yeah.
thing that I will say though about backends relative to our discussion over HTTP calls and things like this is that certain, and I've like Express is a little more freeform in my opinion, right? You can kind of give a response
yeah,
back that looks like anything. And then like Rails, they give you a default where all of your responses are going to have the same format, right? And others, are somewhere in between. And so that's another thing just to keep in mind. And some of them also, like I think there are some libraries in Express that actually um, sit on top of it and kind of push you toward a consistent format in your responses. And so, however you put that together, just keep in mind that, yeah, there are libraries and or frameworks for the back end that are going to make the front end, back end consistency. You can start making a whole bunch of assumptions about what it looks like and what it's going to do under certain circumstances so that you're getting what you expect. And then the other thing that I would push to is, and I've done this especially when I was consistently getting responses from a back end on my front end that I couldn't, I didn't expect it to be, or it was changing on a regular basis because the back end team was working on that particular endpoint and changed stuff or changed the structure of the objects it was giving back or what have you. Is I've actually written API tests for my back end and put them into my test suite and then just run them every week or something so that I have that consistent feedback. Oh, this changed. I got to fix it, right? Before it becomes a customer calling up and going, hey, it doesn't work anymore, right? And so, I mean, there are things you can do to mitigate a lot of these things from the back end and the front end side. And don't be afraid to go reach for some new library, tool, technique, idea, and implement it either through testing or some kind of convention in your code.
And that connects really well with our last podcast episode, which was with Marek. So if you haven't listened to the last episode, after you finish this one, go check it out, because we talked about how to break your front end into smaller pieces. And one of the pieces that we suggested was an API client. So it's a part of your front end application that has the singular responsibility of connecting the front end to the back end. So that's the perfect place for you to do integration tests and make sure that your calls to the backend are being done to the correct endpoint, that you are treating errors correctly, that the data structure that you're getting from successful responses is correct. So go check out this episode because it links really well with everything that we're discussing here.
yeah, and I guess about what Walid also mentioned little before, like uh, trying to adapt the annotation to the different verbs. So like to touch, I think that will be a good. Would like to touch a little more on that. Like
Hmm.
Walid, if you can explain like how you came on approach on that, like and how it helps you to reduce the lines of code in a code base, because that's sounds good for me, because you don't need to create multiple service, just create
Exactly.
annotate, pass the URL and
Exactly, yes. So as I mentioned, like since I tried Nest.js, one of the main differences between Nest and Angular is the usage of the method decorators, like get, put decorators. So I said like probably this is possible with Angular, and knowing like the decorators is just TypeScript pattern, and you can probably build a function like this and then use it with HTTP client module, and then you decorate a particular method inside your classes, and you don't need to make injection of services with a singleton pattern. You rely on the decorator pattern, and you have like probably one file that exports these functions, like at get, at delete, at put, at like, and then just use or import these functions inside your consumer files or components directly, and then you fire the HTTP requests from the components themselves without relying on the service. So I tried that and it
Mhm.
worked well, but I did not try it in production code base.
Mhm.
But it is just kind of inspiration from Nest. And I was just wondering why probably this is not an option inside Angular. Um, Knowing like,
I was about to ask that. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm. I think a lot of options are there. You can, maybe people what might coming to my mind right now is we do we not only pass the only the URL. Sometimes we pass a lot of verbs like HTTP headers and some keys
Hmm.
and
yes,
those things that might be different for different methods and different calls. uh, might be that to making a common annotation for all, or we can create multiple annotation like what we do in Nest, and just add and then you'll get a bunch of annotation, and that will pass the whole process.
yeah. There is kind of evolution inside the framework. The last two releases, I think they introduced the inject function, for instance. You don't need
Hmm.
to basically inject your services in the constructor, right? You use just the inject function, and I see kind of evolution towards more functional programming inside Angular, uh, more than object-oriented, right? Even the routers now are kind of functional. You don't know your guards this way. You can just inline declare function and handle the option of having these decorators.
As the same Nest, you can share your modules and those things are there. But I think Angular also doing standalone components, so Angular is kind of going towards functional, as you told. I think a lot of I think if I remember, Java is also trying to, so all every framework is also trying to uh, like adapt functional web programming, because that's how makes a lot of things easier. Instead of going strictly object oriented, you can create function, pass it around, and do a lot of things with it.
And it also doesn't have to be one or the other. I use a
Yes,
lot of functional
both.
programming inside Angular, inside classes. Like
Hmm.
there are methods in your classes that can be reused. So sometimes you have many different components that have a particular method that can be isolated in a function. So there you can see the two patterns coming together. You can isolate a particular class method in a function and reuse that. So I am personally really happy with the direction that things are going in all languages. I think that functional programming is indeed the right path to all languages and for modern software development. I think there's way too much to make more popular yet inside functional programming, because we still talk about functional programming just inside the scope of creating small functions. And this is, well, one of the main benefits, but it goes so much deeper than that, like way, way, way more deeper than that. And then you have the more beginner level, which is, oh, it's map, filter, and reduce. Also, not just that, it goes way deeper than that. Then you have intermediary level, which would be like trying to keep everything immutable, using const, using data structures that allow you to have immutability. But still, there's just so much more than that. And if people really understood all the different patterns that functional programming gives us, I think that you really can't go back. After you see the level of abstraction that you can have with functional programming, you really can't go back to any other styles of software development. You get hooked into that. It's so much easier after you get the hang of it. But just like Angular, it's a very steep learning curve. If you get any functional programming book, I'm not going to say any because there are too many things in the universe, but most of them, they do I/O at the end, because I/O is a monad and it's difficult to explain what's a monad. So they start with a lot of other things, but they don't teach you how to do a hello world, because hello world is super difficult in functional programming, because it means that you need side effects, and side effects are difficult. So it's a steep learning curve because of that. But if you go through it, it is worth it. I really recommend.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to push us toward picks here. We've been talking for almost an hour, and I think we've pretty well covered this. Real quick, Walid, if people want to follow you on social media or GitHub or things like that, where do you typically hang out?
GitHub, same, my name, Walid Bouguima. Handler is on Rails. For LinkedIn, it is Walid Bouguima as well. Aside from these two, I am always on either Slack or Teams for internal purposes, but these are my two public profiles.
Awesome. Well, if you want to put those into the forum, we'll make sure that those wind up in the show notes. Now, I'm going to stop telling people that this is a new segment, and I'm just going to go for it. We're going to do the self-promotion, what are you working on stuff. Lucas, why don't you start us off?
Okay. The fact that I'm starting the self-promoting section always feels like I'm the salesperson. But anyways,
I'll start it next time then. I'm sorry. I always just pick the person on the end. That's not me.
That's okay. I don't mind. But it is funny. I am going to promote the same thing that I promoted last time, which is my web animations course. I am really pumped about this course. Today, I'm going to record 2 more lessons to it. So it's not ready yet, but there is a waiting list. So if you go to lucaspaganini.com/web animations, you can join the waiting list and guarantee a discount price when it gets launched. And basically, I am covering transitions and animations in the web in CSS and JavaScript. So I'm starting things with no libraries, just the native technologies, what you can accomplish with just native CSS and JavaScript, and really going deeper into web animations, because I think most web developers, some point in their careers, they have done some kind of transition in the front end, but most developers don't have a strong mental model of how that works. So this is the gap that I'm trying to fill, really giving you the right mental model so that you understand how transitions and animations work in CSS and JavaScript. And then if you have that strong mental model, then you can create whatever you want with it. So there's that, and there's also a lot of practices, a lot of exercises. A lot of them I'm just putting them for free on YouTube. So I am releasing, for example, let's do a switch toggle animation. Let's do a different card hover animation. So I'm putting those kinds of tutorials on YouTube. But if you want a step-by-step learning process, you can check out this course on web animation. So just go to lucaspaganini.com/web animation so that you can join the waiting list and guarantee a discount price when it launches.
Awesome. How about you, Subrat?
Yeah, I would like to promote my YouTube channel, which is Fun of Heuristic. So please go guys and check that. I know I haven't posted a video since the last 6 months, so finally I did last Monday. So go and check the video, and I'm promising you guys I will keep continue posting video now onwards. Yeah, well, for now I will promote this.
Awesome. I'm going to throw out. So I just finished putting together the raw videos for the resume course, and I've been talking to a bunch of people. They're either stuck and they're trying to find some place that'll take better care of them, I guess, or you're seeing a lot of big companies here in the U.S. are laying people off, or people are quitting Twitter because they don't like Elon Musk, or for other reasons. I'm not going to dive into the politics of that, but if you're looking for another place to be, the course covers cover letters and resumes, and it's a little bit different approach from what most people do. So I'll just give you kind of the elevator pitch. Most people, what they do is they go on a job board, they look around, they see what's out there, they put together a resume that they think will get them an interview, and then they blast it to everybody on the job board. And the problem is that what you wind up doing is you wind up sending out resumes that aren't really optimized to get you an interview with any one particular company. And so what I walk you through in the course is effectively how to. So I give you my resume and the template that I use, and then I walk you through how that's put together, and then I walk you through, hey, here's how you build that baseline resume that everybody blasts everybody in their mother. And then what I walk you through is how to research the companies you're applying to. And you can do it in about 10 minutes. You can get a pretty good feel for who they are. And then effectively how to use the information that you're picking up in order to write a resume that includes the stuff that they're looking for. And then how to write a cover letter that puts your best foot forward and also explains to them how you are the person that fits the kind of person they're trying to hire. And that one piece in the cover letter is really hard to put across in the resume. And so, or the CV, people call it a CV too, if you're wondering what a resume is. But anyway, so the point is effectively then you've got a resume that gives people all of the qualifications you have for their job and allows them to tick the boxes like you have a college career or you have 10 years of experience. And then you give them the cover letter that explains, I am a really good fit for your company and here's why. And your company's a really good fit for me and here's why. And if you can explain those two things in your cover letter, then you are in a much better position because then they know that you're interested and they can start to validate that you are a good fit. So anyway, go to topenddevs.com/courses. It's listed right there. I'm working on the Keep Current and Learn Quickly course now. So you can pre-order that and then get the lessons as they come out. If you just want my resume template, here's the last one. You can just go to topenddevs.com/resume and you can get it'll just email you the template. So anyway, and that's free. So yeah, that's what I got. Walid, what are you working on?
Actually, most of my time is dedicated to my enterprise level work. But aside from this, I'm focusing on writing new articles on Medium. One topic that is keen to my heart is core web vitals and web performance. So I have a draft right now on Medium. It is not published yet. But this is a very critical topic, especially for e-commerce projects. I'm currently part of a team that works on an e-commerce project that significantly contribute to the company financial situation and income. So it generates a couple of billions. So every single second matters. So that's one of the topics that I'm working on right now, and trying also to make more research on them, knowing that it's not really enough to build resilient, strong, secure applications, but they should be also blazingly fast, because you can lose customers in a matter of seconds. So this is a very good topic that is not really well covered in terms of blog posts as far as I research it now. So I think if this blog post gets out to map the gap between Angular and Core Web Vitals, that would be great. So that's what I'm focusing on right now.
Awesome.
Then
There are
we'll have
also
another episode.
Go ahead.
What I'm saying, then we'll have
Oh,
another
yes,
episode.
with pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, we did some episodes on JavaScript Jabber about Core Web Vitals, so we might get some of the Google engineers to come on and do that, because that's a really good idea to talk about it within the context of Angular and how that works. But yeah, cool. Let us know when those articles are up, and we'll let people know about them. All right, well, let's get to the picks. Lucas doesn't want to go first anymore, so Subrat, what are your picks?
Yeah, I think this week I have looking onto the book called Clean Code. I think it's a pretty famous book, how it should learn. And I also watch a video of the author of Clean Code, and like how he explained why we need to write, and that is good. Like the approach, that's what he's saying is, if you don't write clean code, politician will come inside and they will make some rule how you're gonna code, and it will be bad. So just go and watch the video. I think it's pretty easy to search in internet, and just have a look on a book called Clean Code.
Very cool. We're actually reading Clean Architecture for the book club for Top End Devs. So feel free to join us. Uncle Bob is going to be there tonight as we record this. He came to the first one, and I think he's going to come to the rest of them. And you can go sign up at topenddevs.com/book club. Lucas, what are your picks?
My pick will be Reaper. This is a free-to-use audio editing software that I am actually using right now to record my microphone. And I just really like that it works in all platforms. So all of you Linux fans, you can also use that. You don't get stuck in the environment of using Logic if you're in macOS, and then if you hand that off to your videographer or audio editor, they might be running Windows and this might not work. So Reaper is a really good software for audio editing, and you can just use it for free if you want to. So this is gonna be my pick number 1. My pick number 2 is gonna be, if you're a perfectionist, do a podcast. Like, I have improved so much my perfectionism since I joined this weekly podcast. You have no idea. Like, it's funny because you don't know the behind the scenes of my mind, Chuck, but when you invited me to be the co-host, I was calm and saying, oh yeah, sure, that would be awesome, thank you. But internally in my mind, I was like, holy shit, that's gonna be live content. Like, if I say something wrong, I won't be able to edit that later. I mean, what if I say something completely wrong? Oh my God. And so doing this podcast has helped tremendously. I'm even producing way more content than before. I was polishing my content way too much. I have a video on Angular 15 to be released for 3 more weeks now, and it started by, let me try to do a 3-minute video, and then it became a 20-minute video with animations and like every single thing that is new in Angular. And I always do that. I I get something and I just can't rest until it is really, really, really high quality, which can seem like a good thing, but it's actually not, because there's a point where the quality is already high enough that you should focus more on like outputting more content instead of just trying to polish something eternally. Avatar movie. But yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, sometimes you just gotta put out the movie in less than 10 years of difference, you know? So yeah, I would highly recommend, if you're a perfectionist, like, it doesn't have to be a podcast, but something that is live and it's gonna be published for everybody to see, and you do that in a frequent basis, so every week, or I think every week is better. So if you have some kind of thing that you create content every week in a live format, that helps so much to reduce perfectionism and just get things done. So that's my last pick.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and throw out my board game pick. So it's called The Game, the card game. Yeah, it's a terrible name. It's like code written in code. But the name of the game is The Game, and what it is you have cards numbered 1 to 100, and it's a relatively simple game. But what you do is I'm trying to find it on Board Game Geek, but yeah, it's hard to search for on Board Game Geek because the name sucks. But anyway, I'll find it. But anyway, because I want to tell you what the weight is on Board Game Geek. But here we go. So anyway, what you do is you have like 2 or 3 basically lanes of cards, and you can start them at 1 or 100, and then you stack cards on, and you can stack cards that count up, so you can put cards that are higher than the number if you started at 1, or lower than the number if you started at 100. And then what you do is there are certain rules, like you can put a card that is exactly 10 lower, 10 higher than the other card, and stuff like that. And so if you manage to skip a number, right? So let's say you skipped 93, right? You had 96 and then 92. And then you have 88, then you put 98 on, and you can keep counting down or up. And the whole point, it's a cooperative game, and you're trying to get all of the cards placed. Takes about 20 minutes. I played it with a couple of my friends. It was super fun, super fast. We played it like 3 or 4 times in a row. Board Game Geek rates it as a weight of 1.25. So it's a really, really simple game. Definitely a game that I could play with any of my kids. My youngest might have a little bit of struggle with the strategy, right? When to put what card where, right? And that's too big a jump to go from 53 to 33. But other than that, that's kind of where you go. And you're drawing the cards as you go, so sometimes you don't have a choice but to make a bad play. But yeah, there are those other ways of mitigating, going back or trying to put the cards on another stack. So anyway, that's my pick this week, is The Game. And then another pick I have, this is something that I'm just moving things to now. So the podcasting setup that we're using at the moment is something that I built in Rails, right? And it works pretty well. I'm actually really, really happy with it. It's it does everything I want, right? Well, eventually it will do everything I want, but right now it does a lot of the things that I want that I just couldn't get out of any other system. But we are looking at moving to Red Circle for our media hosting, and so I'm going to pick them. If Lucas talked about starting a podcast. By the way, I am planning on launching in the first quarter of next year a podcast course I guess we're not doing self-promo. Anyway, podcastplaybook.com is where that's going to be at. But anyway, so yeah, they're doing the media hosting, and they're going to manage the RSS feeds. The thing that's nice about them that I didn't really want to build is they do the automatic ad insertion. And so if I have, let's say that we're doing Top End Devs conference next month, right? And I want to promote that, or I put out the podcast course, right? I can put the ad in, and I can tell it to insert it in all of our back episodes. And so if somebody decides I'm going to listen from number 1 to number 567, I think is what we're on JavaScript Jabber, right? It'll put it in there, and they'll get current ads, right, for current products, right? And so then if I have a sponsor from 5 years ago that goes out of business, it's not a dead link, right? And anyway, so that's something that I'm kind of excited about. And then the other thing is I do want to pick our Slack. You go to topenddevs.com/Slack. You should be able to get into the Slack channel, and you can chat with us. And yeah, I love getting the feedback from people, so I'm going to pick that as well. And then yeah, I've gotten into this game on my phone that's probably a giant waste of time, but I'm going to pick it too. It's called Disney Mirrorverse, and so they've got the Disney characters, except they're slightly different, right? Because they're from alternate dimensions, and you do battle, and it's a pretty mindless game, but I'm enjoying it, so I'm going to pick that. All right, Walid, what do you got? What are you going to pick?
Currently impressed by one of the books that I recently bought when I landed in France. It's Team Topologies by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pace. It basically discusses how communication inside teams produces a certain system design patterns, I would say, like how the user experience is shaped by the communication strategies inside teams and organizations, which is very critical to my position now inside the company, because working in a large-scale project is not the same as working in startups, and the communication strategies are not the same. So for me, this is a new topic, and this book is great in exploring these ideas. So it is highly recommended for anyone who is interested in working in large-scale enterprises and projects. The second pick is Fundamentals of Software Architectures by Mark Richards and Neil Ford. That's a very important book for me as well. So I'm trying to sneak into the topic of team topologies and software architectures stemming from front-end development. All these problems in front-end development are not exceptions. They are software development problems, and these books are basically addressing them very deeply. So I'm focusing currently on exploring these areas that are not really implementation related, but they are more kind of system design thinking and more abstract things than concrete implementations. So I highly recommend these two books. And yeah, I finished it, I think, Fundamentals of Software Architectures, and I'm halfway through the Team Topologies book, and I cannot recommend them enough.
All right, cool. Well, thanks for coming, Walid. This was really fun.
It was a pleasure for me, and yeah, it was really fun, and we touched a lot of critical points in front-end development with Angular. I guess there is no production-ready application that doesn't use HTTP client. So that was really nice topic to explore. Thanks a lot.
All right, we'll wrap up here. Till next time, folks, Max out.